Hello, everybody. I'm Steve Crystal. Welcome to this talk about FAI parachute and streamer contests. That's me to the right. I'm Steve Crystal. Emma. We have both been participating in FAI since 2009. We have both been on the streamer and parachute teams a number of times. 3 months ago was the first time either of us ever medaled in one of these events when we won Team Silver in Streamer. Here are our teammates from that incredible event. It's myself, Allison Van Milligan, Kevin Kuchek, and Emma. Let's start out with the nomenclature. S6 and S3. All of these FAI events have these numbers. How do you remember what they are? Well, for streamer, it's very simple. Six. Streamer. You can't forget that. S3, well, you have three chances to fail to deploy. Uh, that is the key to this event, and we'll talk much more about that along the way. Both of these events are very similar. That's Terrell Willard in the photo, putting his model in his tower. Terrell did that fantastic presentation yesterday on parachutes, and I'm going to talk very little about parachutes because just listen to Terrell. He is the absolute expert at it. The rules for both of these events, streamer and parachute, are very similar, and that's why we're covering both of them here. The rockets have specific size requirements. They must be at least 500 millimeters tall, and half of that length has to be 40 millimeters in diameter. Now, it turns out that a Big Bertha actually meets the requirements, and you could certainly use a Big Bertha to try to qualify for the parachute event. For streamer, not so much, and we'll talk about why. Also, in FAI competition, boat tails are okay for these events. At the actual events, the rockets are measured, and we will be doing the same thing at the flyoffs in Missouri. You bring your rockets up beforehand, they get measured, they get a little tag put on them, and they get signed by the judge, and you're good to go. The rules are that for both of these events, you have to fly 3 rounds, 3 flights, but you're only allowed 2 rockets. Now, these are our Russian friends here. You can see they have a few more than 2 rockets, but they actually registered their whole team all at once. For the fly-offs in Missouri, we allow the competitors to actually have 3 rockets. Why is that? Well, because these are flown in rounds, and trying to recover these rockets by yourself between rounds is very, very difficult. So we allow 3 for the fly-offs. In both S3 and S6, the final score is the sum of your 3 flights. Unlike NAR, FAI events are flown in rounds. The first round is longer than the 2 subsequent rounds. First round may be an hour. The subsequent 2 rounds are 45 minutes each. You must fly one of your rockets in the round. If you have a problem in the first round and you can't get your first flight off, you may not launch 2 in the second round. You get 1 flight per round. And at these events, there's a lot of people flying. There's 3 people on your team, 25 teams. That means that 75 people are going to try to launch their streamer or parachute rocket within that launch window. It means that picking air is much more difficult. You may hold up your paddle to fly and have to wait 3, 4, 5 minutes in the queue to actually go. So there's a significant element of luck involved in these events as well. Each of the 2 events, both streamer and parachute, have maximum durations. For parachute, it's 5 minutes. Any amount of time that your rocket is in the air after 5 minutes does not count towards your score. For streamer, it's 3 minutes, 180 seconds. It's very difficult in streamer to get maxes. As you'll notice, these are the timers at the international event, and both overseas and here at the flyoffs, timers will be allowed to use binoculars. For ties at the international event and also at the fly-offs, there is a fourth round. There is almost always a fourth round for parachute, almost never a fourth round for streamer. Um, in order to make the fly off round at the World Championships, you pretty much have to get three 5 minute maxes. The usual is that 8 to 15 flyers will reach that in parachute. Occasionally, you'll get someone in streamer who gets three maxes, but that's not the norm. Pistons are allowed for both S3 and S6, but the new FAI rules, you may not use floating head pistons, only fixed head pistons. And I'll be talking about that more later. Piston tubes may not leave the ground. We tried doing things like attaching them with Kevlar, but that is no longer allowed. Similarities between the two events. The rocket size is 500 millimeters length, 250 for half of it, 40 millimeter, exactly the same for the events. I showed these two rockets. The one on the left is a kit that Mark Petrovich crafted years ago to help many of us start out in the sport. The one on the right is a Russian model. They look a little different, not too much different, but if you're going to concentrate on flying these events, do not concentrate on what your models look like or how they're built. You need to concentrate on picking good air. That is the key. These are duration events. Body tube materials for the rockets, very similar. Fiberglass on the left, paper in the middle, carbon fiber on the right. What's best? Well, for streamer, uh, the lighter the better. For parachute, it truly makes no difference. Mandrels to be used for these. The mandrel at the top is a male mandrel. They used to be available through NARTS, no longer. They generally cost $100 plus. You can use them for making fiberglass. You can use them for building paper models. Uh, my best suggestion at this point is try to find somebody who was a previous flyer who might have one that you can use. The mandrel seen below is a female mold, way more sophisticated, far more expensive, as much as $1,000 to have one of those made. Um, Tim Van Milligan on his Apogee website has a truly fantastic 5.5 hour instructional video of how to use those. The basic concept is you lay up the fiberglass or carbon fiber in each side. A inflatable balloon is then laid down the middle. The two halves are closed. The balloon is inflated, and you let it cure, uh, making for some very smooth airframes. Other similarities, nose cones, a wide variety. They can be fiberglass, they can be vacuum formed, they can be carbon fiber, and a wonderful Chris Flanagan paper nose cone that only he can make is up here to the right. Fins, all the usual. You've got balsa, you've got carbon fiber, you've got glassed balsa, you've got glassed foam. Lots and lots of differences. I'm not going to show you how to make any of those. Very similar to what you do in your regular rockets anyway. Pistons. The rules have changed for piston plugs, ejection plugs. Uh, it it used to be that these were allowed to fly free out of the rocket, no longer. From left to right, that's a European piston. Talk to Matt Steele. He has a collection of dozens of different kinds of European pistons. The second one is the kind the Russians use, particularly for streamer. They're longer, which helps their streamer to sit more towards the upper end of the rocket, helping with the stability. Then the three foam plugs are an open cell foam and then two closed cell foams. I want to give you an idea of how important weight is for S6. Several years ago, my daughter made the team in S6, and our friend Terrell Willard cut plugs out of ultralight foam and sent them to Emma to use. And he weighed them and marked them in 1/100th of a gram. Now, I know that's hard for people to believe, but weight is that important in the streamer contest. Shot cords, Kevlar, internally or externally. The new rule about the ejection plugs not being allowed to fly free. means that people are having to come up with a new way to do this. I came up with a way, which I'll show you in a little bit, that seemed to work, but I've only flown it once. Kits. There are currently kits available. I put the one up on the left because it warms my heart. So many of us started with these kits from Mark Petrovich, um, and they were absolutely beautiful, very inexpensive, and he did them just for the love of the sport and to get more of us involved. The kits to the right, that is one of Tim Van Milligan's kits. It is absolutely good for these events. It's the International Thermal Sailor. Uh, Great instructions on how to build it. A little bit heavy for streamer, but the bottom line is Emma and I have made the team using heavy models in the past. There's an element of how good is your streamer and do you catch good air. So that's very important in this event. And Tim's kits, it's wonderful they're available. Also, Galactic Manufacturing, Mike Nowak, will have some kits made out of cardstock that will be available hopefully by the 1st of March. And there are also, you can look online, Russians, Chinese, Serbians, who will all make rockets for you. Remember that S3 and S6 are duration events. The key is picking good air. You cannot get a 5-minute flight out of any parachute rocket unless you get into a thermal. There's a number of great articles online. George Gassaway, his site hosts one. That's that link there. I highly recommend reading it. And then there are aids to learning to pick good air, streamer poles, which you routinely see at NAR contests, bubble machines, which are a favorite of George's, and I think just kind of liven up the atmosphere. And then there's kestrels. These are the little weather machines that most of us who use them use to look for rising temperatures as an indication of when to fly. Specifics now, specifics about the streamer event. S6 is the simplest event to fly. Emma has always said that flying streamer is the closest you can get to not flying a rocket at all. And I kind of agree. But it is the most difficult event to be consistently successful at. Why is that? Because there's the picking air part of it, there's the streamer part of it. And because it's so easy to fly, it tends to be more heavily contested than any of the other events. So just lots and lots of competition. I'm going to talk to you about making streamers. Everything that I learned about how to make streamers came from Trip Barber and an article that was published in the May June Sport Rocketry of 2007. That is available on the NAR website for any of the events that we're flying. I highly recommend downloading that article. Tons and tons of good information. All right, let me show you how I make streamers. The material I use is Mylar, 1 mil Mylar. That's the most common. You can use lower weight Mylar, but it tends to not hold folds as well. Higher mil weights hold folds okay, but they weigh more, so your model won't go as high. You can purchase big rolls like this of Mylar either online or at gardening hydroponics stores. For FAI, the rule is the streamers must be 10-to-1 ratio. Some flyers use a variety of sizes, 5 inch, 6 inch, 4 inch. Uh, I have done that over the years and have completely settled on 5 by 5 inch. Why? Just because that's what has worked for Emma and me. You can use non-Mylar, and you will see it at the flyoffs in Missouri, but honestly, in Europe, you almost never see it. Why is that? Because the flapping Mylar is just so visible that it is a tremendous aid to your rocket being timed for a longer amount of time. This is how I make streamers. These are the things that I use. That big long thing in the middle, that's the roll of streamer material, 50 feet by 50 inches across. This completely ridiculous 48-inch long ruler that I bought at Harbor Freight only for this. Very inexpensive, but it really helps in drawing the lines. You'll see why in a second. You need a Sharpie, and then instead of using scissors to cut out the Mylar, I use a wrapping paper cutter. There's different kinds, but the benefit of this is that you don't get any stopping along the way. If you use a scissors and you have to reposition it, you often get little jaggies there. And with Mylar, those can lead to a point where the Mylar will tear. Using the wrapping paper cutter, you get a completely smooth cut all the way up the strip. So I highly recommend it. They cost almost nothing. Here is me measuring this out. Obviously, you have to clean off your kitchen table, which can be a problem for some of us. And then I measured these out into 10 50-inch long streamers. I use my wrapping paper cutter to cut out the strips. And then I dust the streamers. I do not believe, if I remember correctly, that Tripp's article suggested this, but when I first started making them, you make these, you roll them up, you squeeze them between metal, and then you bake them in the oven. I found that when I unrolled them, oftentimes the mylar would have melted to itself and would tear holes in them. I started using some baby powder on them, dusting both sides, and I no longer have that problem. You don't need much, just make sure that they're covered so nothing sticks. And as you see here, you do both sides. The picture to the right shows one of the 5 by 50-inch strips laid out on the table. Now, in terms of rolling them up, you can simply roll that whole thing up. But I tend to fold it in half, as you see at the left, and then I crease it, and then I actually fold it again. Why do I do this? Well, because you've gone from 50 to 25 to 12 and a half inches, and it's just way quicker to roll up a 12 and a half inch streamer. Here is how I roll them. The picture at the left shows using a skewer to do it. You can do that, but I actually discovered it's much easier to use a coffee stirring stick that's flat on both sides because you can actually start it folding and then it rolls up. Way, way easier to get these started, especially when they're covered. They're Mylar, which is slippery enough and covered in talcum powder, so can be very difficult to get the roll started. But that's how I do it. Then an added benefit is that once you have it pretty much rolled up, you can use that little coffee stirring stick as a crank, and you can crank it even tighter. Now, there's a happy spot. You crank it as tight as you can because you want that roll as small as it can be, but you still need to have it not so tight that you can get the stick out. So you can play with that. Once you get the stick out, you just take that roll of mylar and you put a piece of tape on it. I tend to use the less adhesive blue tape because once you squeeze these down and bake them, regular masking tape can be a little harder to get off. All right, so I've made a number of the mylar rolls, and then the material to the right is what you use to clamp them down. In the bottom right of that picture, you can see two flat plates of aluminum. That's absolutely the best. It makes it the easiest. I also use, sometimes when I make lots of them, cut pieces of aluminum angle iron, both big pieces and smaller pieces. They definitely work, but they're a little bit more fidgety to work with. So what you do is you're going to place a couple of streamers. On some of these, I can do as many as 3 at a time. And then I am going to put the 2 pieces of metal on both sides and clamp them down. As you can see, this is the flat pieces of metal. It's much, much easier to do these than the other ones. You're going to want to clamp them as tight as possible. I go from clamp to clamp to clamp to make sure they're all as tight as they can possibly be. Then I put them on a tray and I put them in the oven. And I bake mine for an hour and a half. And you bake them on the lowest setting that your oven can go to. Once that's done, let them cool, take them out, and you have these flat little sandwiches of streamer. All right, the next step is attaching an attachment point to your streamers. Now, the NAR rules and FAI rules are different for this. In the FAI, you may have a stiffener in the end of your streamer. You may also use a yoke. I currently have an RFP up on the NAR site suggesting we get rid of this rule change because nobody has any idea what really works better. So this is how I make mine. They've been successful for me. Others do things differently. So I cut the .040 carbon fiber rod into strips just shorter than the 5-inch Mylar. I use like 4 3/4 inches. Why? Because I don't want any of that carbon fiber sticking out beyond the end to create a snag point for the streamer. The yoke, this is how I do my yoke. I take a little bit of Kevlar, wrap it around, put a dot of super glue on each end. I've never had one let loose. Uh, then I tie a loop, an attachment loop. I tend to do mine towards the middle of the streamer. Others will say that you should go to the 3/4 position. Others insist that it must be at the end. I'm not going to get into that fight. This is what has always worked well for me. I then take that yoke that I've made and I lay it out on a piece of Mylar tape, the silver kind or other color that you might want to use. I then take the end of the streamer and I put it up onto the tape, right to the upper edge of the tape, and I then flatten it down. So as you can see in the second picture, you can see the rod sticking up a little bit. I then trim off the end of the streamer just to make it smooth, and I use a second piece of Mylar tape that I put over the top just to secure it. Once I've done that, I then trim the tape down so nothing is overhanging the edge, and that's what my streamers look like. I will tell you, I have become very fastidious about not letting anything stick over the edge. Why? Because I have actually DQ'd streamers. Emma has DQ'd streamers. You would think it's not possible, and boy, do you feel dumb when you do it, but it is actually possible. So you do need to practice this and just try to avoid anything that can cause your streamer to hang up. Ejection plugs, we've talked about, but the rule for restraining ejection plugs, I wanted to point out. This is how I just did a test one. I took a standard ejection plug and I put a piece of Kevlar that I looped. I tied it on the backside and used some foam safe CA. And then you can see how it works. I put the Kevlar through the loop and I put the ejection plug down into my rocket. These are all of my rockets have external Kevlar attachments. And you can see the picture on the right is the one that I just test flew, and it worked fine. Although I did hear from Terrell Willard that he tried one similar to this, and he had a problem with it. So it's just something you're going to have to play around with. We really don't have any experience at this point. All right, packing the streamer. Like I said, it is possible to DQ this event. So this is the technique that I have come up with, somewhat similar to what Terrell shows for parachutes. I use a scrunch method. I do not roll up the streamer from the end away from the attachment side. I just scrunch it, scrunch it, scrunch it. And then the last 5 to 6 inches of the streamer up near the attachment point, I use to smoothly roll around the streamer. The key is that on the backside, away from the attachment point, it is now completely smooth there. And once I put it into my rocket, that's where I will put all of my shot cord, and you can see how I do that. I'm also showing off to the right Emma and my very favorite rocketry tool. It's these ridiculously large forceps that you can buy at Harbor Freight for virtually nothing. We've used them for years, and we start to shake if we go to pack up a parachute or a streamer and we don't have those immediately at hand. But you can also use the other things that Terrell shows in his video, either a straight stick with a notch in it or other kinds of forceps. All right, getting ready to launch these rockets. You've got it all set up. Almost everybody uses pistons, and you almost always get the streamer models back. The other nice part is that very little prep is needed. So the rounds for streamer are the easiest. And as always, pick good air, put good air, pick good air. But being mindful of the fact that there's lots of other people flying, and you can't wait till the end of the round to fly. All right. Going into S3 parachute, Terrell covered a lot of this. That's Emma many, many years ago. I believe that's at Great Meadow at the Capitol Cup, and it looks like it was a successful flight. The key, I can't say this enough for S3 parachute deployment, deployment, deployment. Unlike NAR, in FAI, partial deployment is okay, but unlike NAR, you pretty much need to get 3 maxes to qualify in this event. Maybe not in our flyoffs, but definitely overseas. So if you have something that doesn't open all the way, it's self-penalizing and you won't make the flyoff round. Parachutes. I get mine from Andy at Asp Rocketry. Almost all of us use 36-inch 12-sided canopies. The full pre-cut canopies, like I said, are available from Asp. Terrell talks about making parachutes. He is as successful at this event as any flyer we have, and I tend to use plastic parachutes for practice. Shroud lines, again, you can use cotton, Kevlar, nylon. I find nylon is the best. I believe that that's what Terrell recommended as well. All right. How long should they be? 1.5 to 2 times the diameter of your parachute. I always found those too long. I use a little bit shorter. Terrell recommended making each line individual and tying them to the bottom. That is definitely easier than what I do, which is one line that goes down and comes back up to the next attachment point. The one thing you absolutely do not want to use is the over the canopy egg lofter style lines. Shroud line attachment. Uh, I use half inch by half inch uh, Mylar tape. I do the same thing. I learned it from Terrell to just melt the end of my nylon. I believe there was something, I'm not sure if it's in the ASP instructions, that also recommended putting a dot of CA at the end to keep them from pulling through. Realistically, do not do that. Emma and I did that, and they worked fine the first year, but by the second time we went to use them 6 months later, we didn't realize that the CA had delaminated from the Mylar. And so we had 12 little sticky points for the parachutes to get caught on. And sure enough, we DQ'd out of the event. So do not put CA on the tips. Also, in terms of how you attach these to your shot cord, I like Terrell's method much better. I will be switching to that. In the past, I have used swivels, not because of their swivel ability, but just because they're very quick to attach and detach. Again, see the Terrell video. Number one rule, you do not want to fold parachutes on the field. It is always windy and it is just too much of a pain in the rear end. Remember, the rules for S3 require 3 flights with just 2 rockets. That means you either have to refold your parachute from one of your rockets, or what I do, I actually have pre-folded parachutes I put in baggies, and I bring those, and they're very easy to slip out and attach to the rocket. Terrell suggested that you can take them and put them in an extra body tube, which makes sense because you usually bring an extra anyway in case you have a problem. The one thing you absolutely do not want to do is what's shown on the right, which is what we all learned to do from years of flying Estes rockets, is wrapping the shroud lines around the parachute. Absolutely don't do that for competition parachutes. You can see that's one of my baggy prepared parachutes. You can pre-fold them and do that. Very easy to do on the kitchen table before you leave. And I always put the parachutes in open end up and shot cord management as Terrell showed. All right. A word about something you may have heard of called dethermalizers. Uh, Obviously, if your rocket's going to be flying for 15 or for 5 minutes up there, it's going to drift quite a ways away. Uh, at the end of the time where it's being timed, you don't want it up there anymore. Well, a lot of the Europeans use dethermalizers. The US team has talked about them for years, but we really haven't used them. I want to thank Jordi Rorafont from the Spanish team for providing the picture of what they do. I've seen them fly these, they're amazing. You'll notice on the bottom edge, there's a little piece of fuse sticking out, and then there's a string that wraps around the nose cone shoulder that's put through that fuse with a needle. And then the way this works is you light the fuse right before you launch. 5 minutes in the air, the fuse burns through the burn string and releases half or more of the shroud lines to your parachute, causing it to fall out of the sky. Um, the US team tends not to use these because we're really nervous in the US about flying something with something burning on it. So none of us are really using those. In the past, there have been electronic dethermalizers. A fellow named Zitman made one years ago that's no longer available. This picture to the bottom is a electric dethermalizer, very lightweight, very small. Over on the right side, you can see it has a burn coil. These are made for free flight uh, gliders, and they may be usable on our rockets, but I don't know of anybody who has done one yet. Launch towers. I'm not going to say a lot about these. Clearly, you don't want launch lugs on these rockets. The nice part about this is your tower only needs to be one size, 40 millimeters, that you can use with streamer, parachute, helicopter. They need to be portable. There's a wide variety of ways to make them, but Tim Van Milligan and Apogee have a really nice one on their website that you use with the tripod. All I can tell you about that is do not cheap out on the tripod. I did that for years and finally stopped using tripods because they kept falling over. And then James Duffy convinced me to improve my practice and get a good tripod that cost about $100, and that's what Emma and I use now. It worked absolutely wonderfully in Romania, as you can see by our results. All right, let's talk about pistons. Some of you know about pistons, many of you do not. Let me point this out, that these events, our flyoffs and the actual world championships in America, will be flown on Estes half A motors. Now, uh, Chris Flanagan has done the data for us using a standard American style piston. If you piston well, it can add zero point 0.7 Newton seconds of impulse to your flight. Now, these are only 1.25 Newton second motors. So do the math. It's a 30 to 50% increase in total impulse for half A motors. So definitely for parachute. Uh, Most of you for streamer will also use a piston. Why do I say most of you? Some people fly models where the nose cones are so thin and so deformable that the difference between using a piston and not using a piston can cause the nose cone to deform and your rocket to fly off at an angle. All right. How do pistons work? Again, I apologize for those of you who fully understand this, but for those who don't, I just want to give an idea. A piston, very simple idea. There's an outside, I hope you can see my cursor here. There's an outside tube, and inside the tube is just a rod that goes down through the bottom of it. And at the top, there's a little piston plug that's the same size as the internal diameter of the outer tube. At the bottom of the outer tube, there's a little stop. The idea is, if you look at the second photo, well, before the rocket is launched, the rocket is sitting on top of the piston. The motor is stuck down into the upper end of the piston, and there's no space between the bottom of the motor and that piston head. As you ignite the rocket, it starts to produce gas. And long before there's enough gas to produce enough thrust to have the rocket move on its own, it starts to fill up that tube. Well, in order to put gas into that tube, the tube needs to start moving up. And it starts doing that. It does it very rapidly. And at the bottom of this, you can see the little plug. When that plug hits the piston head, the rocket flies free. And you can see a couple of pictures. I think this is George Gassaway's and Jim Stiller's rockets on pistons. This piston and rocket are in a tower, which is how most of the US flyers fly them. Uh, this one over to the right, we refer to as a naked piston, no tower. And this is how many of the Europeans launch. They do not have towers at all. All right. The difference between a fixed and floating head, really simple. The one to the right here, this is a floating head. It's just a simple rod that goes down and touches the ground. The piston head just sits down on top of that inside that piston tube. A fixed head piston, as you can see here, is actually attached to the rod, and you can tell how much force is involved. My fixed head pistons actually use a little piece of metal that goes through the piston and through the rod. If you piston well, the amount of force that hits that piston head is just amazing. And for regular tubes, it can cause those tubes to just rip in half. The picture to the right here, to give you an idea of the difference, a fixed head piston, this whole piston will just go up to the stop and the rocket will go shooting off the top of it. For a floating head piston, that stop hits the piston head, which is free to move. This whole thing sails up in the air a little bit before the rocket pressurizes the tube enough to blow the rocket off the tube. Those of us in the NAR and those of us who have done a lot of work working with pistons really believe that floating heads are better. And we have a little bit of verification in that the FAI no longer allows floating head pistons to be used, and the only team that used them was us. So I do think the bigger issue for them was that these tubes were flying free and sailing all over the place and hitting our neighbors. So perhaps not the friendliest pistons to use. All right, how do I make pistons? You'll need some white glue. I use standard BMS or Estes 13 millimeter tubing, 34 inches in length, a 1 inch piece of coupler tube, and then, like I said, white glue. And I do something a little different with Mylar tape. I'll show you in a second. These are very easy to make. All right. You want to put a thick layer of glue in the end of the tube and just take the coupler tube and push the tube down onto it. Why a thick layer of glue? Because if you do it too thin, it'll seize up before you get the coupler all the way in there. So these are 1 inch long couplers in the end of the tube. I also put a piece of Mylar tape around the upper end of the tube. I do that because as you're fiddling to get your motor fit into the tube correctly, sometimes you have to twist it back and forth. And in the past, I would occasionally tear the upper end of the piston tube, which meant that I had to start all over. I found a single layer of Mylar around the top keeps that from happening. Has saved us a lot of fuss over the years. All right. For fixed head pistons, when those of us on the team were switching over to fixed head pistons, we learned very quickly that unreinforced piston tubes will simply rip the ends off the tube, causing the tube to sail up in the air, and you are disqualified. I found a very simple way to deal with this. It is simply strapping tape, 8 inches long. You cut off a piece, you lay it down, and you wrap it around. Oddly enough, for 13 millimeter tubes, it's almost the exact right width. It overlaps just a little bit. Takes literally seconds to do. So to use your piston, the fixed head piston is going to go down into the tube. This is just two views of that. And then you need to attach your motor to the tube. I can't emphasize this enough that the number one priority in using pistons is to make sure that that fit between the motor and the piston tube is exactly what you want it. I see people all the time put their motors in the rocket and then start fiddling around and try to get in it. Number one step should be to fix or to fit that motor into the tube. I call it the Goldilocks fit, tight but not too tight. You really do want these tighter than what most of you are used to using. Not so tight that it won't release, but tighter than you would think. Then you're going to pull the motor out, put the igniter and igniter plug back in, and put the motor back into the piston tube. I take that little piece of paper off and fold the igniter wires down. I then take that and slide it into my rocket. In my other talk yesterday, I talked about these things that I conveniently call crystal windows. That's to secure the motor in the rocket. As I mentioned yesterday, a simple piece of Mylar tape stuck down to this will keep that motor from moving forward or backwards. These rockets do not have a forward plug in them. I find that two of these on two sides of the rocket are just fine. You do not need to do three. And like I said, for 13 and 18 millimeter motors, I have never had one let go. All right. So then once you've got your motor into the rocket and you've got it on the piston tube, you're going to take the whole thing out and put it in the ground. For fixed head pistons, the bottom part of this piston needs to be affixed to the ground somehow, which can make putting it into a tower somewhat difficult. So I'm going to show you this trick that many of us are using now. We have extension tubes on our pistons. There's other reason to use these. They're called air gap or buffer tubes. But the major reason I like to use them now is because they make setting all this up with a fixed head piston much easier. All of the same steps in terms of fitting the motor into the upper end of that tube, then putting that tube into the rocket. Uh, the bottom end of these tubes have a coupler. That's what's going to go into your long piston tube. And then I just use masking tape to tape around it. That's what it looks like here. You can see that there's a little extension there. Uh, th- that way you can put the whole piston tube and your attachment apparatus into your tower or below your tower, and you can still put your rocket into the tower very easily, slide it down into this tube with no fuss, and put a piece of tape around it. However, remember to put the piece of tape around there. I'm just saying, not like I would have ever forgotten that, but remember to put the tape there. All right, concluding. S3 and S6 are very similar. Oh, sorry about that. Very, very similar. They both use the same style rockets. You can actually use the same rockets for both events. They're both duration events. Picking good air, picking good air, picking good air is absolutely critical to these two events. For S3, at least 36-inch chutes, deployment, deployment, deployment. As Terrell suggested yesterday, and I completely agree, I use parachutes with spill holes cut in them and practice flying them not off pistons, but just on quarter A motors. Again, the most important thing in this event is getting 3 successful deployments. S6 model weight is critical and good streamers are critical. Emma and I have been very successful in this event for a long time without putting a whole lot of thought into it. Our models are not always the lightest, but these streamers that we learned to make from Trip Barber have done wonderful for us over the years. The streamers that I showed you how to make are exactly what we flew in Romania and ended up on the medal stand. All right. At the end, really easy events to fly, really hard to be good at. But every now and then, if you fly them long enough, things might work out well for you. All right, everybody, I hope I've taught you enough to be able to do these events. And I am going to stop sharing now and go to the chat. Uh, and I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing. Okay, I think I've done that. I don't want to stop the broadcast. All right, folks, I am going to go to the Q&A if there's questions in there. Oh, okay. If somebody wants to let me know if you're hearing me, okay. All right. Why doesn't the U.S. Doug Hilson asks, why doesn't the U.S. like naked pistons? Because it's still possible for your rocket to fly off at an angle. Using the launch towers is just added safety. Uh, what kind of weight, Todd, am I seeing in paper S6 models, including the streamer? I can't tell you. And I think that the 5-inch streamers weigh about 6 grams. These models, anywhere between usually around 9 to 12 grams for the paper kind of models. Tim's paper model is heavier. I don't know exactly 14 or 15 grams. But again, don't let that stop you. These events, Emma and I have been very successful over the years flying rockets that really aren't the lowest weight in the game. So, okay. My friend Kevin, oh, hold on, I just lost it. Uh, okay, I'm still missing Kevin's question. Uh, the new rules say that no part of the model may be attached or jettisoned. Do you know the reason behind the change? Debris concerns? Uh, I think that this was an attempt to be environmentally friendly. I know for those of us that have spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe, that seems a little difficult to believe, but I think it's a good intention. All right. Uh, Brian Music, God bless you. Yes, that is a real sounding rocket fin in the background. Uh, I have some very silly friends who can occasionally find stuff and send it to me in the mail. Uh, all right. Uh, Al de la Iglesia, who I am forever indebted to for paper rockets, asked, "How about using carbon fiber piston tubes?" Al, you can. All of the work that we have done, and if you remember that the picture of the three European tubes and the American tube, all of the work that we have done indicate that the lighter your tube, the better. All of that stuff that you use with carbon fiber tubes and all of those fittings at the top and the bottom, the Europeans put a spring in them, and they're running pistons that are half the length of ours. They're nowhere near as good. So, believe it or not, they over there do not have access to the kind of paper tubes that we have access to here. So that's a huge benefit to us. They're easy to use. Like I said, I might not have mentioned it, but if you use that little gap tube or buffer tube, almost all of the soot from the motor ends up in that. Virtually nothing in the lower tube. You can reuse the tubes, uh, which was really distressing to me since I have so many of those tubes, and now I'm not using them up at the rate that I used to. But I highly recommend using paper tubes. Uh, Bob asked, the last slide with the models, orange rocket on the left. Looks like it's got multiple rings. Bob, those aren't the rings. Those were what you're seeing is through the tube. Uh, you're seeing two of those Russian style ejection plugs. They generally only use one for streamer rockets, but if you buy them from the Russians, they send you with two in them to keep the models from being crushed. They're very effective. I truly believe that having your streamer more forward is a really good idea, stability wise. Uh, Matt Steele asked me, what about the Drell Deploy Max that's in testing right now? Should be available after the Arizona Cup. That is a wonderful item. Matt, I am going to leave it up to individuals to decide if they want to risk losing one of those on a parachute flight. Even if the Deploy Max is used as a dethermalizer, which it can be, it's a great idea. They weigh nothing, wonderful to use. But with the winds that we get, I'm not sure that at 5 minutes, even with a dethermalizer, that rocket will be recoverable. So I will leave that to up to others, but it's definitely one of the first things we've had to use. Uh, all right, Tom Dish, are scorpion tail streamers the most commonly used in FAI? No Z folds. Yes, Tom, I would say yes. Um, that you'll notice that when you take that 50-inch long streamer and you fold it in half, when you roll that bad boy up and when you unfold it, you've got folds that are going in two different directions. If you fold it again, now you've got four different directions. So, yes, scorpion tail has worked very well for us. Again, I always say this until the military comes up with a use for 5 by 50-inch Mylar streamers, we're not really going to know real data. And I don't think that's going to happen. So, again, I've used all different kinds of streamers over the years. I tend to use 5 by 50-inch just because that's what's worked well for us so many times over the years. Uh, how long do I bake the streamers in the oven, Matt? I usually do an hour and a half. All right. Let me see if there are more questions. Terrace, great to see you. Uh, the restraining plug was partially due to timers having problems figuring out, oh, if there was a separation or not. Terrace is actually a judge in these contests and a wonderful friend of the U.S. team, and that makes a ton of sense. Then Severio, another one of our wonderful Canadian friends, asks, are the size of the folds relevant? Severio, I presume that they are. I don't do anything special to control for them. I try to make them as short as possible. Again, just it's really hard to get good data on streamers. And most of us just don't want to spend the time. There have been a ton of articles over the years in sport rocketry and in the R&D competitions. Read through them. Like I said, I've kind of given up trying to figure out mathematically what's best. Uh, but I use what I use because it seems to work. Uh, let's see. Interesting. Is that a Century tracking scope, Bob? Good eye again. Yes, that's a Century tracking scope. Uh, all right. Chad asked, is the common practice 100% pleated or 80 to 90%? Chad, again, I do 100% pleated. I think the idea of doing the 80 to 90% was so that you could have a smooth spot around the end to wrap around. Honestly, it's not an issue, even if they're pleated. So I do not do that. I just fold the whole thing. Uh, let's see here. Bob Alway. What's the temperature that I use in my oven? Bob, it's 200 because that's the lowest I can go. I've never over baked them. I will tell you, it is absolutely imperative, though, that you use a talcum powder on them. Since I started that, I never have a problem with the fold stain. I never have a problem with them ripping when you unwrap them. Uh, Andy, is half mil Mylar good for streamers? I would say no. And I base that upon research and experience that Kevin Kuchek has done. Kevin came up with this new streamer using half mil that required a really complicated folding mechanism. I did it, Kevin did it, and we all used them one time and then stopped. I think half mil is just not strong enough to give you the kind of flapping action. Clearly, the flapping action is a combination of rocket weight and streamer material and streamer folding. Like I said, I tend to use 1 mil 5 by 50 just because that's worked. Kevin suggested to me that he had found some 3/4 mil Mylar. I've not tried it yet. I may do it. If it goes a little bit higher, does that make a difference? Theoretically, yes, especially in dead air, but again, I haven't done it. Chad, percentage of length folded. I fold 100% of the streamer. Best streamer thickness is 0.5. Terry, good to see you. In the January February issue, it talks about Jay Marsh's quad fold streamer. Yes, Terry, what I showed you, Jay and I do exactly the same thing that we came to from com- completely separately. Uh, I did it out of laziness. I think Jay put more thought into it, but it's the same thing. You take the 50-inch long streamer, fold it in half, 25 inches, fold it in half again. You can either take one end and fold it down and the other end and fold it down, or just fold it in half. There's no data that suggests one is better than the other, but that's exactly what we used in Romania. And I think that Kevin was flying streamers made by Jay. Emma and I flew mine, and like you saw, we both did real well. So, uh, are participants in the U.S. team trials not going to be able to litter? Yes, we are going to follow that rule. That uh, uh, we will fly the fly-offs with the same rules except that you will be allowed to have 3 rockets. One final thing, uh, we are for the fly-offs. For the juniors, as always, they just show up and fly. For the seniors, because we're anticipating a large number of people are going to want to do this, clearly we can't accommodate 30 or 40 people all wanting to fly a streamer or parachute in a single round. We don't have the timers available. So we've come up with this way of doing it where you need to fly to qualify to go to the fly-offs. That's on the NAR website. You post your scores just like an NRC, and Matt and Mike will pick, I don't know, the top 10, 15. We haven't decided yet, but that's just really to keep the fly-offs manageable. These events are so easy to fly. There's just no way we could do it fairly for everybody if we've got 20, 30, 40 people wanting to fly it. So, Chad, one more question. How sharp are the creases after baking? A sealing iron would make them definitely crisper, but I've not found that it makes any real difference. All right, everybody, it's time for me to stop so we can get on with the next one. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.